Tec Sounds presents EduTrends.
Welcome to the EduTrends podcast, conversations with experts from around the globe about the discovery and creation of the future of higher education and lifelong learning. I am José Pepe Escamilla, Director of Tech Labs, an educational innovation unit of Tecnológico de Monterrey. Over the past 3 decades, I have been working on innovative pedagogies and learning technologies. I hope this EduTrends podcast will help us understand the future of learning. I visited the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. to meet with Rebecca Winthrop, who is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Universal Education at Brookings. We try to answer if classrooms are evolving as fast as technological transformations. Rebecca defined what does a paradigm shift that uses leapfrogging looks like in education. She shared with us a leapfrog pathway that includes 4 buckets in that continuum. Hi, I'm in Washington, D.C., visiting the Brookings Institution, and today I have the opportunity to talk to Rebecca Winthrop. Rebecca?
Hi, thank you for having me. Thanks for coming to visit.
Thanks for receiving me. Rebecca, I was telling you a while ago that on the last 100 years, music has advanced so much. So at the beginning of the 20th century, if you wanted to listen to music, you had to listen to a real band. No? Then became the phonograph and was a disruptive technology. Later, the CDs, then the iPod, digital music, and now streaming. So I'm a very kind of a music guy. You know, I like music a lot. But on the last maybe 8 years, I haven't bought almost no CDs, no digital compact music. The transformation has been amazing in music. And when we look at education, I don't think that education has taken advantage of those technologies. What do you think?
That's a really good question and a comparison that I think is often made. And I have been looking a lot at that question that I'll tell you about in a minute. But there was one thing I wanted to note. I think a lot of people say that, and I've seen this at least in the United States, in our news media say, you know, if you were frozen in time 100 years ago and then you woke up 100 years later, you would recognize nothing in society but a school. You would only recognize a school. Do you have that same type of narrative in Mexico?
Yes, we do.
So I would say to that, one, yes, that's true, but it doesn't mean that necessarily what's happening inside classrooms is exactly the same as it was 100 years ago. So I think that's maybe a little unfair to the sort of hard work and teaching and learning innovations that have happened inside classrooms over the many, many years in the teaching profession. But the statement overall is something that I've been thinking about a lot, but more with the lens of how you democratize and much more rapidly expand access to high quality teaching and learning. Because in your example about music, you know, it was hard I think that's a great example because it was hard to get to go hear a live music. Probably you had to make the time. First of all, you had to have the time. You maybe had to pay some money, right? So not everybody had access to that.
But we was lousy also, the
right?
musicians.
Well, I'm sure there was fabulous music, but in the example, it shows, I think that there's a lot more equity in access to all sorts of different types of music. You know, to hear a fabulous high-end opera sung 100 years ago, it probably cost you a lot and only a certain elite would get to go. Yes. Now, probably anybody can listen to it. So I've been thinking a lot about transformation in education systems with that lens. What could we do to rapidly accelerate progress so all young people in the world could have access to a really high quality teaching and learning experience that prepares them for the future, both work, life, and citizenship. So yeah, that's something I've been thinking a lot about. Excuse me.
And tell me, what do you think will be the first steps that we should take?
Well, one of the things we've been doing a lot of research here with the team at our Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution is around the role of innovation and what can we learn from education innovations around the world to sort of see what could education transformation look like in the future. So we have done a large study. We looked at almost 3,000 education innovations in 166 countries. So we have a very large global catalog. And we looked to see, what is happening in the ground. And the first thing we noted was that actually there's lots of innovation happening in education in every corner of the globe. It's like people are hungry for new ways of doing business in education. And then the second thing we noticed is that a lot of what's happening can point towards what we call a leapfrog pathway. Now, we got this idea of leapfrogging from different sectors. And in English, leapfrogging is used. In Spanish, I think we were talking earlier, you said it's not a great translation, but something like a quantum leap or a salto
cuántico.
Salta cuántico. And we looked at other sectors. We looked at telecommunications and the massive move from, the long time and expensive time that it takes to lay copper wire for landlines for telephones. And in certain parts of the world, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, people barely did that. They just jumped right to mobile phone use and massive expansion of access to information, mobile banking. Once you got on cell phones, you don't have to build bank branches in rural areas that never had access to credit, and which is really important for particularly for poor families. And that was a massive expansion of access to credit in the financial inclusion sector, for example. So these leapfrog ideas were taken from other sectors, and we started to think, what would a paradigm shift that uses leapfrogging as the model look like in education? And we noticed that there's really probably two big differences from other sectors. You can't just take it from another sector and apply it to education. And the two big differences, at least we thought, were one, you have to really be clear where you want to leapfrog to. Like, if you want to do a salto cuántico, what is your end goal? In other sectors, it's very clear. In financial inclusion, everyone agrees. It's a bank account, access to credit that can help foster, families' abilities to get loans, tide themselves over, invest. Nobody has a disagreement. In education, the purpose of education, what would you define as the purpose of education? I know I'm asking questions of the interviewer now.
You're not supposed to do that, Rebecca. No, preparing people for life and work to become better citizens.
Right. So that is a really close definition to what I would say, but everybody seems to have a slightly different definition. Some people focus on democracy and citizenship. Some people focus on work and individual skills. Some, folks focus on lifelong learning and sort of your individual sort of personal fulfillment, right? So it's not 100% clear exactly what the end goal is. Some people focus, very specifically, just reading and writing and math, the basics is what the real focus should be. So we said, we're going to plant our flag. When we say leapfrogging to where? We're going to plant our flag on a type of education that, yes, develops strong academic competence, but also develops the full suite of, quote unquote, 21st century skills that young people need to thrive in work, life, and citizenship. And that sort of breadth of competence and skills is what we think every kid should have an opportunity to access, no matter where they're born. And I think, in certain schools around the world, largely for more wealthy communities, kids are getting that type of education, but in most schools they're not. So that was one big difference. And then the second big difference, if you think about leapfrogging, taking the idea, the concept from another sector and applying it to education, is in most cases, the legacy infrastructure, so the copper wires laid down to make landlines for telecommunication, or the physical building of a bank, people don't need them anymore. They don't use them. They don't deal with them. They're thrown out. You don't need them anymore. And we kept thinking, the legacy infrastructure of education is really schools. And would you really want to throw out schools? And we said, we don't think so. Some people do argue you should throw out schools. We think that they serve a really important equity function, given that every family and community has different sort of levels of assets and capabilities. But what you need to do is transform what schools actually look like. What do they do inside schools? What's the teaching and learning process? What does it look like? Schools being much more connected, with what's happening out in communities, et cetera. So those are kind of our two big differences for the education sector.
And how advanced are you in this leapfrog process? So you have defined your flag, as you say, flag.
Of where to leapfrog to.
Where to leapfrog to.
So what we have done to date is we have developed something called a leapfrog pathway, which is a general guide on how you could travel across a leapfrog type of continuum to really rapidly accelerate progress. And we developed that through looking at the innovations around the world, comparing them to existing evidence in the academic literature about what works to transform teaching and learning to make sure young people get that full breadth of skills and competencies. And it really consists of kind of four big buckets. The first is to expand your menu of teaching and learning experiences to, yes, include direct instruction, but much more space for active, engaged, playful learning experiences. The second big bucket, again, is to think a little bit differently about how you surface and recognize the learning that's happening among students. And that can be, yes, of course, you need, basic assessments on academic skills, but you also need to be able to recognize and support different competencies and skills, whether it's critical thinking or teamwork and collaboration or empathy. And then also think a little bit differently about how people out in society, whether they're employers, community groups, faith-based groups, are given the signal or recognize talent. And that gets into the badging, the micro-credentials, sort of more individualized ways of recognizing learning. So that's the second bucket, move along that continuum. The third bucket is your area of expertise, leveraging technology and data. So how do you leverage technology in a way that doesn't just substitute or augment for existing analog functions that are happening, but really can transform and modify the entire teaching and learning experience, what's possible. And then the last one is about diversifying the people and places where, the fourth big bucket, where learning takes place. So yes, you still need professional, well-trained, high-quality teachers, but more and more they can partner and pair with non-professional educators, be they a peer from an older grade, be they a community member, a grandparent with some oral tradition to share, an employer, an artist, etc. And really think about crowding in and widening the profile of who educators are and where learning can take place. Okay. So those are the kind of four big pieces that we've developed in terms of thinking about this path to travel on if you want to leapfrog.
Okay, so the first one is a more engaging teaching. The second one is more the
individualized recognition
and
of learning.
The third one is the power of technology, and the third one is
The fourth one is diversifying people and places.
Not only the teacher but other actors that can participate. And I think there is Alan Kay that say that the future is here, but is not
evenly distributed.
Where's do you know if the future is here, and what should we look at?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the main messages that I think we are now in the process, and we'd love your help with this or advice also, in the process of trying to get out there, is exactly what you just said, which is this is possible. Leapfrogging is possible. And the reason we know it's possible is we see small examples around the world of it actually happening on the ground. I'll give you, excuse me, one of my favorite examples, which is from Latin America, from Brazil. There was this initiative, which maybe you've heard of, from the sort of previous Minister of Education in the state of Amazonas in Brazil, which was trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together differently in order to make sure all young people in his state got access to a high quality education from primary through secondary school. Now, traditionally, the outside of the capital of Amazonas state, it's, as you can imagine, a very, very rural, hard to reach, remote part of the world with lots of very small communities, many of them indigenous communities, mainly had access to primary school for many, many years, hadn't had access to secondary school. A national law around children's right to education was passed in Brazil some time ago, which gave the legal framework to say all kids should have access to secondary school. So he was trying to deliver on that. And he knew that there weren't enough teachers in the entire state to be able to give us a traditional model of secondary school to every single kid in the state. So what he did is work with communities and teacher organizations and developed a new model. He divided the teaching profession into two. He made the best, very best teachers, rock star teaching television stars, broadcasting from the capital, Manaus, via two-way video uplink to small little classrooms around the rest of the state. It was in real time, and he made the rest of the teachers were mentoring teachers. And they were there to support with the technology, but also provide all the, range of other supports that you need as a teacher when you're dealing with young people, coaching and making sure they did their homework, right? All this other stuff. And it's worked really well. It's scaled very quickly. The kids are more or less performing on average in national exams. And in a few short years, you went from a place that had no access to secondary school to access to secondary school with a curriculum, I should say, that was very high quality because it had been localized and tailored to their particular context.
That's a good example. And when you say good quality, how do you measure the quality?
Of the curriculum.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the things that was really important in this example is there was a distance learning curriculum that existed in Brazil, and it was national, and they got permission to take it, and with some of the best teachers, and really integrate relevant contextual factors that made connected to young people's lived experiences. So I think you could assess the curriculum on many different dimensions. In this particular case, I think it was a good curriculum, and the fact that it was very localized and contextually relevant makes a real difference, especially when you're dealing with education for marginalized communities, to have examples and problems and of contexts where they can immediately connect.
So that's very interesting because that's an aspect. Going back to my example of music, I'm a heavy user of Spotify, one of the first one, because I used to live in Europe at that time. So I got in 2008, I was one of the first clients. And it can give me some recommendations on what I learned. And so my experience is personalized. So what do you think about personalized learning? Because in this case, it seems like the example of the Amazonas is more or less treating equally every student.
Yeah, and you're right. It isn't, I would say it's a huge leapfrog in terms of access and equity. And I think it's probably, a halfway leapfrog in terms of the mode of teaching and learning. So I'll give you an example, which is a very interesting example that I have visited recently, and I happen to be on the board of this NGO. There's a group called Imagine Worldwide, and they are dedicated to really improving literacy around the world. And they kind of broker and do matchmaking and do research around interesting individualized adaptive learning products and services, and very remote, poor communities who need it and can help scale it. And they're doing testing this approach at the moment, and I think it has huge potential. So this is where they're doing a randomized control trial in Malawi, the Malawian government, and an NGO called VSO. And it is basically primary schools in Malawi, which government primary schools are very, very underfunded. So average class size, 100 kids to one teacher. And their learning levels are very low, which is not surprising when you have 100 kids to one teacher. And so what they've done is they've piloted this tablet-based literacy and math program where the kids get, a little bit of time each week to go and take a tablet, which is powered by a solar battery, because this is a place that has no electricity. And what's amazing about it is it goes from zero literacy and scaffolds and brings them up to literacy. So they log on by looking for their picture, and every kid can, they do it in shifts. So, every kid logs on by clicking on their picture, and then there's a digital teacher. And it's this software that's made by this really interesting company, nonprofit called 1 Billion. And the digital teacher starts walking them through on basic learning how to read.
The digital teacher is on the tablet.
On the tablet.
Okay.
And it's both sound recognition, it's letter recognition. They do writing, they test on writing, they test speaking. And these kids are learning to read from zero, basically. And it's every time they use it, it remembers where it left off. Every kid goes at a different pace because some kids need a lot more practice on certain parts. And you could have the best teacher in the world, and you have 100 kids in a class, you are very limited to how you can, differentiate instruction to those kids. Here, it's totally individualized, and it's, so far the study isn't done yet, but looks really, really promising. So to me, that's also a leapfrog. That's a big breakthrough.
Sure. Well, you said there's an organization or a company, 1 Billion?
1 Billion is a non-NGO. And they actually just won. There's something called an X Prize. Are you familiar with the X Prize? So there was an X Prize for literacy for out-of-school kids. And they just won it with another group.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're kind of best in class in the world on this.
Sounds so they were tied, two winners.
Tied, two winners.
Oh, okay. I was aware about that competition, but not about the winners.
Yeah, the 1 Billion and a group called Kit School won.
Okay.
Yeah, tied.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I should say this is the beginning of a journey. It is far from perfect. There's a lot of work to be, figure out how to make it scale smoothly, but just also the actual software, how to make it the most productive it is. There's a lot of work to do, but to me, that's a great example of a huge leapfrog potential move.
Okay. And we can also learn from failure. Do you have some examples of an essay that didn't work out very well and that we can learn from?
So I will prefer not to name names.
Sure.
But what I will say is we looked at all when we looked at all these education innovations, across all these countries, many of them involved educational technology. Half of them, about 1,500, and that's a lot of groups. And we didn't look at. Well, first of all, a lot of them were new and they don't have sort of, gold standard independent evaluations. So so we didn't necessarily look at that. But what we did do is we looked at what we would call their leapfrog potential. And we used what we consider to be sort of a very, very basic, well-accepted rubric, the SAMR framework, substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition, that was developed by Ruben Putadera out of Harvard a while back, which basically says, if technology just substitutes for an analog function, there might be some reasons to use it. So if you're doing a multiplication worksheet and instead of doing it on paper, you do it on a tablet, maybe you're saving trees or paper or not having to, the teacher do photocopies. But it's not really changing the teaching and learning process. You are not drastically going to move anything. They're still getting the same type of a thing. If you augment it where, you have a multiplication worksheet on a tablet and it automatically grades, and it then frees up some of the teacher's time because they don't have to grade and maybe they can do more real-time instruction. Oh, half the class didn't get, multiplying by 4s. Let's go over that. That could be very helpful, and that's a good thing, but it's not going to massively change the teaching and learning experience either. Like, it's still teaching multiplication through worksheets, right? So you're looking for things where you can have higher leapfrog potential, where you can modify what's possible and redefine what's possible. I would say, interesting in the Brazil example that they use technology to redefine what was possible because, can we even deliver secondary schools to these kids? Well, let's redefine what's possible. Yes, we can. We just have to do it by two-way video uplink. I would say the same for sort of 1 billion and Imagine Worldwide. Can we even think about giving kids in a class of 100 kids per student some individualized attention in literacy and numeracy? Yes, it's just not going to be through keep training that poor teacher to figure out how to do differentiated instruction. It's going to be through a tech app. So there was a number of really interesting innovations that we would say have the potential to leapfrog or modify and redefine what's possible. But there was a bunch, in fact, the majority, that were just augmenting and substituting. And, it's not that that's bad. It's just that it's not going to really change the world. It's going to make marginal, incrementally more efficient existing types of teaching and learning. It will not lead to leapfrogging, the type of big change we really need. And I think there's lots of great examples of directions that we could use technology. So you could imagine what falls into substitution and augmentation, the different types of products.
So we have to look for more of those examples in the world.
Yeah. I mean, we found a number, but they're by no means in the majority from our sample. We didn't look at every single education innovation in the world because it's a fast-moving target. It changes every year, but we learned a lot about the education innovation community by looking so extensively.
Okay. Moving back to your framework of 4 pillars, the second one related to micro-credential or different level of
recognition of learning, transforming how we recognize
Yes.
learning.
What are you work particularly more on K-12? Are you thinking on micro-credentials for K-12, or you're thinking on more like a lifelong learning journey?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting point. I'll give you an example of something that I think is really exemplifies what is possible. I think there's many different ways of recognizing student learning differently that could be more individualized. And one of them comes out of South Africa. It's a project called Go for Gold. And it works with high school students, very, very sort of marginalized communities and townships. And it pairs with employers in the construction industry. And South Africa, the reason this whole program started is because South Africa had a lot of jobs open in the construction industry, and that includes project foremen, architects, engineers, project managers. And they had, even with high youth unemployment rates, they had a hard time finding South African young people graduating who they could hire. And they were having to import talent from other countries. So basically, they have this sort of twinning experience where the school partners at the end of high school, at the end of secondary school, partners with employers in the construction industry. And the young people spend a year in a company doing jobs, as part of the team, and they're getting education and instruction from the school. They're getting classes, but they're getting mentorship and guidance from the employers, what it's actually like to work in an environment. And all of a sudden, you might see kids who didn't do great in their history exam, but really have the interpersonal skills to work with team members to put a project management timeline together and follow up with them, really start to blossom. And the companies watch these kids, mentor and watch and guide them. And at the end of the year, they assess them themselves based on a real life experience, not based on just their grades on a transcript, an academic subject from the end of high school, from having seen them in real life for a year. And they decide, do these young people have the potential to work in our company? And if they decide yes, they fully pay for them to go to higher education. And then the young people have to repay that debt by working for a couple years with them. And so far, about 80%, last I checked, of the students get fully supported to go on to fully supported for higher education. 80% of the students, companies say, yeah, they have the skills we need, because they're also looking for soft skills, right? And that's hard to see in a school transcript. So that's a way of thinking a little bit differently. It's not the same as micro-credentialing, but it is a great way of being more individualized in your assessment of someone's competencies.
So it gets also on the fourth bucket of increasing
diversifying the people and places.
Yes,
that's exactly right.
Yeah, because you're taking
and also the first bucket of having a teaching and learning environment that's much more engaged, active, experiential. I use the umbrella playful learning to mean iterative, experiential, connected with people, real life. Yeah,
very interesting. So just a final question.
Yes.
In 10 years from now, let's say in 2030, where will you be in this quantum leapfrog situation?
Well,
or where the world will be? Different parts of the world.
Okay, to say where I'll be, let me at the moment say where we are now, the world. So at the moment, if we don't do anything and we work on that incremental change, that substitution augmentation, which is, again, as I say, fine, it's not that it's bad, but I don't think it is the tool we need to address the challenge. At the moment, if we continue as we are, almost 900 million young people by 2030 are not going to have the skills they need in basic, very basic secondary level. 900 million, half the entire youth population by 2030 won't have the basic skills at secondary level skills in literacy, numeracy, critical thinking, and problem solving. That is the mere floor. You know what I mean? We're aiming for more. So we have a big problem. And the other big problem is that the pace of change is not fast. Like at the moment, if we do nothing differently, it's going to take 100 years for the poorest kids to catch up with the richest kids in most countries around the world.
How many years?
100.
100.
There's a 100-year gap.
Okay.
So that's where we are now. I mean, I would love to see that a lot of different jurisdictions or different nonprofit groups around the world start really trying to do things differently, trying to focus on transformation. First of all, putting front and center this idea that a breadth of competencies and skills is really the goal. Don't just focus on reading, writing, and math for the poor kids and a full load of design thinking and STEM education and computational thinking and arts and creativity for the rich kids. Don't do that. They both need it. So this idea of breadth of skills, and then trying to think really creatively about how you put the pieces of the puzzle of the teaching and learning experience in an education system together differently. I don't know where we'll get. I know what we're going to work on next is to develop a series of playbooks to really help give more concrete guidance about how you could go about doing that, both looking at technology and looking at various other themes. So we'll see. But we've got to work together.
I wish you a lot of success for the sake of those 900 million children, and where we can learn more about this and look for in the future of these playbooks.
So at the moment, we are in the process of writing and researching the playbooks, so they're not online. But what you can do is you can go to the Brookings website, brookings.edu, and look for Leapfrogging Inequality. And that is the book that our most recent publication on leapfrogging. And it outlines the idea, the 4 buckets, and it looks at a lot of the different innovations around the world that are examples. And then people can contact us. Stay tuned. We'll put you on our newsletter.
Sure.
Yes.
I will be looking at your work.
Brookings.edu. We'd be happy to connect with people who are interested. We need all sorts of good ideas.
Sure. So I hope, I wish you a lot of success in this journey, Rebecca, and thank you very much for receiving me.
Muchísimas gracias a usted.
Gracias a ti.
Chao.
Hasta luego.
For more information, visit observatory.tech.mx/EduTrends podcast. Thanks to Tecnológico de Monterrey and the Tec Sounds team. Tec Sounds producer, Miguel Mejia. EduTrends producer, Esteban Venegas and Cristian Guijosa. Post-production, Max Perez. Stay tuned for the next episode of EduTrends and visit Tec Sounds in your favorite podcast app for other great shows and content.